Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 7, and this is session 25. In our previous session, let's just take ourselves to the verse that we're concerned with and have been concerned with for a while. Romans chapter 13 and verse 12. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. And I have told you all along that first phrase, the night is far spent, and the following phrase, the day is at hand, is describing the timing of the dispensation of grace, not describing the dispensation of grace itself. Today, you're going to learn more about that timing, why that's the issue. And all the things that we've been learning in these last weeks now can kind of begin to get tied up into a bundle to get all of that thinking consolidated in our mind. And so we're going to be covering some things today that are going to continue to generate our Heavenly Father's attitude in us, His hatred and abhorrence for Satan's works of darkness in this world and the things that are taking place there. And we left off last time looking at Satan's twofold covering. Now, here's where I want to just pause for a moment. Because what I'd like to do now is take all the information that we've learned up to this point and let me put it into a single narrative that will work us all the way through to the dispensation of grace so that all of those things begin to make sense. In other words, they fit into a single storyline so that you can see that. So here's what you're going to hear at the beginning of this. You're going to hear me refer to all of those things that we have mentioned and looked at the Scriptures. And by the way, because we have done that, I'm not going to be stopping to take us through the Scriptures in this. I'm just going to, because we've already looked at them, we've already examined them, we've already been studying them. And so what I'm going to do now is put it all together. And so that you can see the transition of the things that have been happening in the world with regard to the night being far spent. So with that being said, let me start at the beginning. Back before Adam and the things are created, Satan is up in the third heaven and he decides to be like the Most High. We understand what that means, that he wants to be the possessor of heaven and earth. And so in his objective to be the possessor of the earth, he becomes that through the fall of Adam. Jesus refers to him as the prince of this world. But what he has to do is not only get it, but he has to hold on to it and he has to strengthen his grip on it so that he can retain it. Because what is God going to do? Naturally, God is going to take steps to repossess the earth back to himself. And so, because of that, to hold on to the earth, here's what Satan has to do. He has to produce, I'm trying to find it up here, he has to produce the world of the ungodly. And he did that after Adam falls in the Garden of Eden and the activities that Satan engages in the world. He does succeed in 10 generations of bringing the world into being the world of the ungodly. And that's recorded in Genesis chapters 3 through 6. And that old world, as Peter called it, was destroyed in God's judgment of the flood. And because of what happened, and there's only 8 people left, God, for all intents and purposes, hits the reset button and things start over again. And in the days following the flood, we have a day condition on this earth in which men know God. And we looked at those Scriptures. And they not only knew the true and the living God, but they knew some things about God. And they understood what God liked and what He didn't like, and things about His character. And so And so as soon as that happens, Satan knows that again he has to begin redeveloping the world of the ungodly. And so that's what we have here, that starting from here and moving on, he is bringing the world back into being the world of the ungodly. But something has changed, because God made significant changes at the flood between the way things were before the flood and the way things are after the flood. Satan's strategy changes in accordance with that. And here's what happens. He is now using as his main tool something very different to accomplish this world of the ungodly than he did before the flood. Now, Satan is using as his primary means of producing the world of the ungodly is the propagation of his untruth. Now, it's not to say that before the flood that Satan didn't have untruths and lies and things like that. Those were there. But that was not the main tool that he used prior to the flood. And because of the changes that happened at the flood, his strategy had to change in accordance with that. And so in the time after the flood, or as Peter wrote, in the heavens and the earth which are now, Satan is using these untruths that he has manufactured, and what he wants to do is replace the truth with his untruths. And then we know from the things that we've seen that those untruths are the darkness that Satan is promoting in this world. And that means that the truth is also the light. So you have the darkness of Satan's untruth and the light of God's truth. Those untruths, called the darkness, are meant to produce something. Satan is working very hard to do that. So let's talk about how Satan changed that post-flood world. How did he go about bringing into existence a condition that he needed to have happen very badly? Understand that from Genesis chapter 9 to Genesis chapter 17, and we could do that right here, that is Genesis chapters 9 to 17. That knowing that from that time the world was in that day status. In other words, they were conscious of the true and living God, and they knew about things, they knew things about God. And men operated that way. But as men began to multiply, remember it's just Noah and his family that come off the ark. And in the generations that follow, men still know about God. Nimrod knows about God. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, knows about God. And so, while much of the world does that, here's what happens. Satan begins to introduce his untruths in a variety of ways. One of those ways that we observed was through the alternative thinking. In other words, beginning to look at things a little differently than the way God looks at that. And so, and by the way, that alternative thinking was their vain imaginations. That's what it was called back over there in the book of Genesis. And one of the first things that Satan begins to attack with his untruths is the truth of God consciousness. Who is the true and the living God? And he works in two particular ways to reverse the understanding of who the true and living God is. And we talked about those, and here they are. The first thing he does is he presents untruths that causes men to no longer glorify God as God. The second thing is they became unthankful to God. Those two things, when I say them that way, don't sound like much. But what's in there is a lot. For example, when he talks about them not glorifying God as God, what did that lead to? They began to make idols of four-footed beasts and creeping things and birds until it says they worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator. And you know what that means? They lost the light of God consciousness, that they no longer could identify the true and the living God. And as the memory of God began to fade from the earth, this alternative thinking about God and what really was God began to increase. And so that's the increase of Satan's darkness. And so he works with the natural sinfulness of men to accelerate his darkness. Remember, that darkness is the untruths, and I'm saying it that way for a reason. Yes, it's a lie. Yes, it is. But what Satan is doing is he is producing something to not just lie about the truth, he is producing something to replace the truth, so that the light of the truth is no longer understood by men. And that first light, of course, is the light of God consciousness. And when Satan's untruths became more predominant, listen, when it says, and they worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, here's what Satan has done. He has succeeded in bringing into existence a condition called night. That happened in Genesis 17. Now, it's not important for our discussion to go back over there and to see the exact event when the scale shifted and untruth became more known and more understood and more believed and more practiced. It's not important to see the exact event as it is to understand right now that in the general understanding in the hearts and the minds of men, there was a shift in which it was no longer a day. And I'm calling it a day, I'm doing that just because when you talk about a day, you're talking about a period of time in which the light reigns. And in this case, what the Bible is talking about, when it talks about light and darkness, the light is the truth, and of course, darkness is that untruth. And that's why the Bible uses those particular terms. And so, when the light begins to fade and the darkness of untruth begins to rise, when those things begin to happen, then Satan brings a condition of night into the world, and what he really wants to do is he wants the darkness of that night to increase. Just because his untruths hold sway doesn't mean they're the only thing out there. There is still some light of the truth. He wants to exterminate that light and extinguish that light so that there's nothing but his untruths. And so what now? Now that's what he did after this day period. So now that he's brought the night into existence, let's move it a little further forward. What is he doing in this night? Because it is now night, Satan can now begin to function in earnest as the power of darkness. And it is by that power that he does something now. When it becomes night, this is the point in which he brings in the first of those two things that we were looking at the end of the lesson last week. The first thing he does is he brings in a covering over all the people. And we talked about what a covering does. A covering, if you're under that covering, you don't see what's happening on the other side. Now, I am going to show you this verse in a moment again because it's the last verse that we looked at last week. But I'm just saying that it's at that time that Satan did something, and that covering was especially for the Gentiles. And the reason it was especially for the Gentiles is because God's purpose in calling out Abraham and making an unconditional covenant with him to make of them a great nation and to be the people through whom God would repossess the earth back from the adversary to himself, then Satan is making a plan whereby if his policies of evil against the nation of Israel fail, this covering will make it all the more difficult for the Gentiles to see that light and be impacted by it. At the same time, that covering can also be applied to the nation of Israel. And so he's hoping that is going to have its effects on them. But if it doesn't, and God's light of the truth gets established in Israel, then he has a foothold with the Gentiles. And that covering has three aspects to it. The first thing it's designed to do is to keep people in the darkness or the untruth that is now more predominant and has brought the world into a night situation. Remember that verse? The night is far spent. That's part of the thinking of what Paul expects us to understand, that there was a time when Satan's night came into existence by the preponderance of untruth over truth being in the hearts and the lives of men. And now he brings this covering in, and it, number one, is made to keep people in the darkness. The second thing it's meant to do is obstruct the light of the truth. It's supposed to make it so that someone can be faced with the light of the truth and not see it. And the third thing it's meant to do is intensify this increasing darkness. It's meant to intensify the darkness of his untruth, to make it even more cemented in, and to replace what truths are still there and still believed. Those are going to go away. Look, think of it like this. You look at what happens in our country or what happens in the world, and 50 years ago, things that people said would never, ever happen have long since happened. This is exactly the methodology that Satan is using with his untruths. Those last truths that refuse to be overthrown, people thought, we will always believe this. And that turned out not to be the case. Those truths began to be overthrown, and that's why it's an increasing darkness. And as more of those last truths begin to get overthrown, the darkness of Satan's night begins to increase. And that's what that covering was designed to do. And so Satan is moving constantly to do that. And in order to fuel this, he has put into place certain works of darkness. They are certain deeds that get performed that are specifically designed to fuel and promote and increase the darkness of his untruth in the world. In fact, in Romans 13, we're about to be looking at some of those works of darkness that we're supposed to, as it says here, let us therefore cast off the works of darkness. And yes?
Three parts, would you say those again?
Yeah, absolutely. It was meant to keep people in the darkness. It was meant to obstruct them from seeing the light. And thirdly, it was meant to intensify the darkness. You're welcome. Now let's talk about Satan's strategy with the nation of Israel, because he does this covering. Yes, it's meant to impact everybody, including the Jewish people, but it is especially designed for the Gentiles. And by the way, that's exactly what it is, because when God enters into that, you know, when the nation comes along, they receive the law at Mount Sinai and all of that. Remember, the law is that middle wall of partition. And so you have Israel nigh unto God, but remember, what are the Gentiles? They are far off, remember? So that covering is made to make sure that those Gentiles remain in a far off condition. And so now let's talk about what is he doing with Israel and the nations as he continues. Well, what he wants to do with Israel is make sure that they do not come to those two issues that, sitting back in the prophets, they were originally told that they were supposed to be in their influencing of the world. And Jesus talks about that himself. Remember, they're first of all supposed to be the light of the world, and they're supposed to be the salt of the earth. And it is those two issues that Satan is working to make sure they don't become. Which is why when Jesus shows up in his public ministry, he talks about, hey, if you've got a light, you don't hide it. You set it on a hill so it gives light to everyone. That's what the nation of Israel was supposed to do. They had the true and the living God. And that light of the true and the living God was supposed to be shown to all the nations of the world. And they didn't know that. Remember, when Paul goes to Mars Hill, he sees an idol to every god imaginable except for the one true God. And he says, that's the one I want to talk to you about. Because the Gentiles are in darkness. And if you're in darkness, you can't see the truth. I'm talking about the spiritual darkness now. And so, as he's working with them, by the time before Jesus begins his public ministry, that nation, their light has gone out, and as Jesus talks about, their salt had lost its savor. They were in a condition that Satan had been very successful with them. And so, as those courses of punishment, as you see here, begin to unfold themselves, by the time they get to the fifth course of punishment, the first part of the fifth course of punishment, when Israel is carried away captive out of the land to Babylon, when that is done, not only is Israel cast out of the land, but that gave Satan the legal right to do some things that up to that point he was not able to do. Number one, Satan was able to actually enter into that land. Number two, he was able to set up his base of operations in that land. Number three, Israel became, and I'm going to quote the prophets here, Israel became Satan's lawful captive. And number four, Satan brought his secondary covering into effect. That first covering took place when he got his night established, and now that the fifth course of punishment has arrived, Israel is out of the land, Satan can now come into the land, set up his base of operations. Israel is his lawful captive, and now Satan sets in his veil. And we talked about that veil, like the veil of the temple between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. It was a thick, tightly woven, dense curtain that was able to keep anybody from seeing to what was going on inside the Holy of Holies. On top of the covering, Satan puts now this veil, and what is it? If you've got one covering over people and now you've put another covering over them, you know what you've done? You have now intensified the density and the thickness of the darkness that they are under. And that's exactly what Satan was doing there. Now bring that verse to your attention, because it's the one we were on last time. Because when Isaiah is talking about this, he's not only talking about what was done, but he's taking you all the way forward to the start of the kingdom, and he's talking about what God is going to do at the start of that kingdom. And the first thing, there's going to be this huge feast that takes place for all the people of the world. And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wine on the leaves, of fat things full of marrow, of wines on the leaves well refined. And we talked about that terminology the last time. It's not the kind of things that we normally use, but this is a high royal feast that is made for, and as you can see, and in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast. All the people of the world are going to come at the setup of the kingdom, but there's something else God is going to do at that time, and that's what we're after. And He will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all the people, this covering that was put back here when Satan brought his night of darkness into existence. It says He will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. And that thing got done right there. Now, up here in the kingdom, both of those aspects are going to be destroyed by the Lord, so that when the word of the Lord goes forth from Jerusalem unto the nations of the world, the darkness of being under that covering and under that veil are no longer going to have to be dealt with by the people of the world. They will be able to hear and to see the truth, the light of the truth, and be more likely to respond positively to that light. Now let's talk about Satan's veil over the nations, because we've talked about his covering, we've introduced the veil. We know one day God is going to do away with both of those, but in the meantime, both the covering and the veil are still in place when John the Baptist shows up. still in place at the resurrection of the Lord, and is still in place today in this dispensation of grace, both the covering and the veil. And with both of those things being true, here's what that veil served to do. We talked about the covering was going to do. Here's what the veil served to do. It served to thicken and intensify Satan's night. And that night, of course, is the condition of the prevailing of untruth over truth. So that veil thickens and intensifies the darkness of Satan's night. Number two, it increases Satan's ability to keep men from seeing the light. If the covering was made to do that, the veil intensifies that. Number three, it increases Satan's ability to keep men in darkness. And then number four, it darkens Satan's night toward a particular goal. Is at this point, I want to make a single statement that's kind of out of the timeline, and then we'll move right back into it. You know that when God interrupted His program with Israel to bring in this dispensation of grace, the timing of that was back at Romans 13:12. The night was far spent. Now, I know we haven't looked at that term, far spent, but we understand just from what it is that the difference between far spent and completely spent is that if it's far spent, there's still a little bit left to go. And so, when this dispensation of grace is over, the night, because when it was interrupted, it was far spent, still has a little bit to go. And the day of the Lord's wrath, it will be, as it says there, at hand. In other words, it's not quite here, but it's almost here. So when we see that, here's what we're talking about, the timing. In other words, God choosing when along this whole timeline that He chooses to bring in this dispensation of Gentile grace and suspend temporarily His program with Israel. When that program resumes, then that little bit of the night is going to transpire, and now I'm going to take you back to the veil and make that statement again. Because the fourth thing that the veil is intended to do is darken Satan's night in connection with a particular goal that he wants to reach out here. Now, Linda asked me a couple of weeks ago, sometime in the next 2 years, are you going to tell us what that goal is? You're going to find out about that goal today. No, you will. I will tell it to you today. Promises, promises. Okay. Promises were made, gifts were exchanged. Okay, so here it is. You are going to find out what that is today. And the reason I haven't mentioned it to you before isn't like the perils of Pauline, where I'm trying to tie you to the railroad tracks and you'll come back next week to see, how she gets loose. What I'm trying to do is get you to look at this thing that Satan, I'm going to call it this. As a matter of fact, if you looked at I didn't have it on that, but if you had looked at the first screen on the PowerPoint, the second session today deals with Satan's finest hour. And that is truly what is going to be taking place out here in the remaining portion of that night. And the reason I haven't told you what that was, what constitutes his final hour, what constitutes that most despicable act, and what you're going to find out, and now we're actually getting to the place now where you're going to get information that's not a review of all those things that we've learned up to this point, but now we're about to get into the areas that you haven't learned yet. But what you do know is that all of these things that Satan has been doing, the whole reason he brought his night into existence, listen to this carefully, the whole purpose behind bringing in his night and putting the covering and increasing the darkness and putting in the veil and continuing to do that was for one reason. It wasn't because I just hate God and I just want to do stuff to mess Him up. It is not that harem-scarum or that willy-nilly. This is a planned, orchestrated agenda that Satan has been working toward doing this thing out here. I'm not going to do it today, but next week what I will do at the start is take you back, and I'm going to show you where Satan wanted to do this before. But listen, here's something, part of it you don't know. He had not yet earned the right to do that. Look, I want to say it this way, just so you'll understand. I keep using these terms, and then I go home and I think about it, and I think, does everybody understand what I'm saying when I use my terms to describe things? Satan has to play by the rules. And when you say it, you say, well, what makes you think Satan has to play by the rules? Because this whole thing is about proving who is the rightful possessor of heaven and earth. Who really deserves to be the possessor of heaven and earth. Satan wants to be like the Most High. Genesis 32 defines that as being the possessor of heaven and earth. He wants to do that. God, you say, well, God is the rightful possessor of heaven and earth. So here's what God has said. I am not going to just use my omnipotent power to cancel out Satan. I am going to prove that I am the rightful possessor, the only deserving rightful possessor of heaven and earth. If He wasn't going to establish the rules of engagement, if you were omnipotent God, I'll put Sarita on the spot because she's sitting in front. Sarita, if you were the omnipotent God and Satan had this plan of evil whereby he was going to usurp the heavens and the earth to himself, if you were going to use your power as God, what could you do to end that?
Speak the word.
Yeah, you know what? You would have immediately just consigned him to the lake of fire, wouldn't you? And that's what people always wonder. If God knows everything, and God knew Satan was going to rebel, why did He allow him to rebel? And then when he did rebel, how come He just throw him in the lake of fire? Because the accusation is the only reason that you're the possess is because you're omnipotent God and you're the big kid on the block and you can beat the rest of us up, and it's not that you're right or that the people want you. Listen carefully, I'm giving you something here that's important. It's not that the people want you, it's that you can make everybody because you have omnipotent power. And God says, then we're going to establish some rules of engagement whereby I am not going to immediately consign you to the lake of fire, but we'll let this play out so that the whole creation will acknowledge who is the rightful possessor of heaven and earth. And Satan immediately now is working this plan to come on through. And so I don't want to get off track here, so I'm almost where I need to be here. So he puts this veil in. It does the four things. I'm going to make that final statement one more time. Satan's veil on top of his covering is increasing all three things that the covering did. But in addition to that, his veil is enhancing Satan's night toward the goal that is sitting out here in the remaining portion of this night, and that has been his goal from the beginning. Because if he can do that, he will indeed have his finest hour. That's what he's been. But he has to earn, you know what? He had to be able to do something before he could bring his covering in. That night had to be able to come into existence, then he could bring in his covering. He had to be able to have Israel as his lawful captive before he could bring in that veil. And he's going to have to do something else. Think of it like this. There's hoops to jump through and hurdles to overcome and obstacles to avoid. And if he can do all of that, he will actually earn the right to do something out here in this night that he has been wanting to do from the very beginning. That God has been working to keep him from accomplishing by putting these obstacles and hurdles and pitfalls in his way. And so when it says the night is far spent, what do you understand was the condition of the world at this point right here when God interrupted the program. What was the condition of the world? Yeah, it was fit to destruction because it had reached a zenith of ungodliness. And what was the condition of the nation of Israel? Not just the world, but the nation of Israel. They had also reached a zenith of ungodliness. And when their prophesied Messiah showed up, what did they do to Him? They crucified Him. Now, that's not to say that there were not individuals who believed in Him, but the nation as a whole and the religious leadership of the nation rejected Him. And when He got to this place, now look, again, I'm going to tell you what's here, but you need to understand that when it got to this place right here, and I'm going to tell you how you know that. When it got to that place that both Israel and the world had reached a zenith of ungodliness, that Romans 13:12 was saying, when the night was far spent, the reason God interrupted that program and issued this dispensation of Gentile grace is because at that point right there, Satan had crossed the final hurdle to have the right to do what he wanted to do. But God also had the right to, before Satan could do that, to bring in this dispensation of Gentile grace. And He did. And that's the timing issue. That before Satan could have his finest hour, God put that program on hold, brought in this dispensation of grace. And there's a reason for doing it right there. That's the timing issue. Now, I have to get somewhere, so give me just a couple more minutes before we take the break here. As you already know, both that covering and that veil will be destroyed at the kingdom. But during the first 3 installments of this 5th course of punishment, here, here, and here, during that time, here's what Satan is doing. He is, for lack of a better word, he is cementing or setting in stone the darkness of his night. He has extinguished the light of the Gentile world so that the Gentiles are worshiping every god but the true and living God. And in Israel, he has it's just all but extinguished in the nation. And in those first 3 installments of the 5th course of punishment, Satan's veil became firmly fixed on the nations of the world. And by saying it that way, here's what I mean. There is nothing, by the time these happen, there is nothing the nations can do to keep that veil from having its effect on them. And once it comes on them, there's nothing they can do to undo it. They're under it, and they're not going to be able to avoid it, and they're not going to be able to cast it off. And that's what he's doing in those first 3. And you understand what these are. These are coming along, that this is when they're carried away captive. This is when they go back to rebuild. You get to those last prophets. They talk about that those 400 years of silence when God's not going to say anything to Israel. There's going to be any more scriptures. Not going to be any prophets. There's not going to be thus saith the Lord. There's going to be a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. And by the time they get to John the Baptist, when that silence gets broken, Satan has cemented his veil on the nations of the world. Now let's talk about Satan's strategy in the climactic stage of the program. And the climactic stage, as you know, because you've marked it on your timeline, begins with John the Baptist. So now we've moved up to this point. And as Israel enters her climactic stage, Satan's program also enters its climactic stage. And he has to do 2 things in the climactic stage of his program. Number 1, he has to deal with Israel's Messiah, who is now functioning as the light of the world. He's going to have to deal with Jesus Christ. And the second thing he's going to have to do is he is going to bring the effects of his veil and put them on the nation of Israel to extinguish the... Now I'm going to introduce you to 2 things. Jesus is the light of the world. There is truth that is being spoken by Him, and it is the light that lighteth every man. And what's the difference between those two words? One has a capital L, and when you see the capital L, that's talking about the Lord Himself as the light, and that's what we're going to read in John chapter 1 in the next session. The small case L is the light of the truth. Yeah, it's the information it's what God is saying is the truth, and that's the small case L. You know what, really? If you don't understand that, you'll read John 1 and you'll just think about things generically as all being the same. And it's not. Jesus is saying some things, and those things are the light of the truth. But He Himself is the light. You see, that's kind of two different issues. Satan has to deal with both of those issues in the climactic stage. And as a result of that second issue, then here's what's going to happen. Israel is going to join hands with the Gentiles. You've already read about this. We read about it back in Psalm 2. They're going to join hands with the Gentiles, and they're going to say, in fact it says they took counsel together against the Lord and against His Christ, saying, let us break their bands asunder and let us cast their cords from us. You remember that? We don't want anything to do with the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which is God the Father, and we don't want anything to do with His Christ. Let us break their bands asunder and cast their cords from us, because when they got to hear, it wasn't just the world that wasn't interested in Jesus Christ. If you don't think they weren't, go back and read about the Chinese dynasties and see where Jesus and the true and living God fits into that picture. Are you kidding? They are steeped in the darkness of this world. And this world doesn't understand what that is. It goes back and is, oh, the Han Dynasty and all this, oh, it went on for centuries, and oh, what a great showpiece of... Are you kidding me? God's not looking at that way. They have lost... You know what the basic light, little L-I-G-H-T? It's the light of what God is the true and living God. That's the basic fundamental question. By the way, if you don't have light consciousness, you can't be saved. You've got to know who the true and living God is. And so as a result, here's what's happening. The world has completely gone over to the darkness. That veil and covering are having their effect. When Jesus shows up, now what Satan wants to do in response to Jesus shining a light in the darkness of the nation is he wants to take the effects of His veil and bring it onto the nation itself, and so that the nation does exactly what he wants. He finally just wants it. He needs it. It's all working toward what's happening right out here. That he wants them to join with the world and confederate with the world against God and His Christ. That is more important than you might think. So, they do that. I know the thing went off, and that's why I'm looking at these notes. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop here and we'll take our break. Because here's what you need to understand. These things happen in component parts. There is an order to them. Look, do you remember the condition of the nation right here when the climactic stage started? Well, I mean, what was the condition of the world at this time? Okay, they were in darkness, right? And by the time the nation, remember these first three, this is when His veil really gets cemented and all. And when Jesus shows up, the whole nation doesn't turn to Him. So the nation is in darkness, the world is in darkness. And when it gets here, look, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but there's a rejection There's a rejection that takes place by the time they get here. So God brings in His climactic stage, and His Son comes on the scene. And what did they do with Him? They crucified Him. And then there is that extension of mercy that follows, where God gives them 3 honest opportunities to change their mind about the historical Jesus of Nazareth being the prophesied Christ, their Messiah. And what do? They reject all 3 opportunities and become more violent with each one until at the last one, when Stephen stands up and gives them that message, what do? They kill him. And it is at that point, if I just tell it to you, you know I can't leave it alone. I'm going to have to show you the verses about it. I can't do it today. I can do it next week. But I'm going to have to show you the verse about it. Otherwise, you know all you have? You have my opinion. I can't send you out of here only knowing my opinion. Well, you'll go out today knowing my opinion, but next week I will show you the verses. But I've been talking to you about this like it's one set. Here's what happened. Back here, remember I told you, just a while ago I said what he needs is, he needs to be able to say, the people don't want you, God. So you know what they did? By the time they got to the end of the 3rd installment of the 5th course of punishment, the nations and the nation had rejected God the Father. And what does He do? He sends His Son into the world to be the light of the world. But He came to His own, and His own, what? Received Him not. They crucified Him, and they rejected the Son. And in Acts chapter 2, following the cross, you have the administration of the 3rd person of the Godhead, the Spirit. And what do they do with those 3 opportunities? They reject all 3 of them. And you know what? Under this time in Acts chapter 1 to Acts chapter 8, that ministry of the Spirit is rejected, and the world has now served notice. We don't want God the Father, we don't want God the Son, and we don't want God the Spirit. And when it got to that point right there, Satan had earned the right to do that thing. Finally, with that 3rd rejection, he earned the right to do that thing in his night he's been planning on since the beginning. But before he could, God said, time out. Time out, because this is all in Israel's program. And God said, we're going to suspend that thing, and I'm going to bring in this dispensation of Gentile grace. And those works of darkness that have been feeding this night that Satan has been producing, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cast off those works of darkness and impact his ability to do what he wants to do when he gets out into this remaining portion of his night. And he can't stand for that. Now, there's more to see here, and I still haven't told you what that is. But we will.